Hello everybody, it's Frank, I'm back, and today I'm going to do something I haven't done previously, but I'm actually kind of excited about. If you've watched any of the videos on this channel, you know that I did a 3-part retrospective on Dune, the book, and then when the movie came out, reviewed that both as a piece of cinema and also comparing directly to the book. Today I'm going to take a look at a book and a film using that basic question, which is better, the book or the movie? And I want to go back in time to do this. And today I'm going to talk about Robert Heinlein's military science fiction classic, Starship Troopers. Now, this was a book written back in the 1950s, and there was a movie of the same name that appeared in the 1990s, a movie that I have to say I've seen a couple times, had a blast with it. It's popcorn entertainment, and as I have now discovered after having read this book, the two bear virtually no resemblance to each other. So this is actually going to be fun, because if the movie had just kind of gone paint by the numbers regarding the book, there really wouldn't be much to say here. So I hope you enjoy this little comparison and contrast between a classic novel and the film that was based loosely upon it. Now, let's set the premise here. Starship Troopers is a story that takes place in the future when Earth is part of the Terran Federation, and you have largely a militaristic society, or at least one in which only those who have served in the military have the full rights of citizenship, that is, the right to vote. And in this society, we have a young man named Johnny Rico, who is an unlikely soldier, and the story will take us through his entry into the military, going through basic training as he gets ready to join the mobile infantry, and then fighting an interstellar war against their enemy, the Bug, and we go along that track. Now, that basic premise holds in the film of the same name. Beyond that, however, there are very, very few similarities. So the book is a first-person point of view. It is Johnny talking to you from page 1 to the very end. And this is just fine, this is wonderful, but like in a lot of first-person narratives, it can be very confining because we only see the world as he sees it. And this is not something you can really do when you go into motion pictures, and so consequently, the movie borrows pieces that are referenced throughout the book and enlarges them, specifically individuals who were in Johnny's life before he entered the military, and those would be the characters of Carmen and Carl specifically. Those characters are mentioned very, very briefly in the book, as well as a character named Dizzy. All of them go off to the military. 2 of them will die, and they're briefly mentioned as having died, just one line later on in the story after we never really saw them. And the character of Carmen is actually, she's in the story and then she's not anymore, and we really don't know what happened to her. There are only 2 characters in the book that are also prominent in the movie. Aside from Johnny, we have Sergeant Zim, who is Johnny's basic training sergeant. And Sergeant Zim comes across very much like the man who is portrayed in the book. Now, there are some fascinating changes that the movie made, and I'll get to those in a minute, but I want to just kind of lay you some little bit of groundwork about the book if you're thinking about reading it. For a war story, to be honest with you, it's not very exciting. In fact, the vast majority of the book is spent away from war. Roughly half of the book is spent in training on Earth, and then most of the time in the back half of the book, we're actually on the Roger Young, which is the ship that Johnny is based on, or other locations. that are far removed from battle, and we hear about things that have gone on. There are a couple of significant battles in the book, the attack on Klendathu and the climactic battle on Planet P, that are also in the film. But for the most part, this is about pages and pages of telling us about what his life is like rather than showing us. That's a little off-putting, I think. Sometimes that happens with first-person point of view. We get whole pages that talk about military armor, that talk about the military hierarchy, that talk about the makeup of his ship, as in the makeup of the ship. It is very, very long and intricate. And if you have a military mindset or military background or love the military sci-fi genre, you'll probably be into this. If you're not so much, then this might actually become kind of monotonous. But the thing that I think holds together the book and really makes it, I think, a strong work for many people is its moral grounding. This is a book that has a very strong philosophical bent, and you have characters who go into considerable debates about critical issues of man and responsibility in society. Now I'm going to touch on those themes in just a little bit, but the movie I want to contrast a little bit. The movie does not really have a philosophy. The movie you might call Starship Troopers 90210. It takes the characters of Johnny and Carmen and Diz and Carl, puts them into high school early in this film. In fact, they're graduating high school. That is not part of the book at all, but it allows us to establish relationships, the friendships and the rivalries between them. It does get a little soap opera-ish. There's another rival for Carmen that Johnny has to confront. But we do see all of these characters go off to war, have different roles. Some of them survive, some do not, but we get to see their arcs play out. And so we get to see the emotional resonance of what war does to them and how it affects them when they learn of the deaths, or in a couple of cases, see the deaths of their friends. And for me, that is a much more interesting way to approach the story. But look, there's an element of cheese here. There is an element of the CW network where it looks like we're appealing to young adults here, because clearly that was a target demographic of the film. So I think when you look at the movie, you have to go into this from the perspective of, let me get my soda and my popcorn and have a good time. Another thing that the movie does really well, I've talked about this before, is Sergeant Zim. He is a very, very tough sergeant, played by a great character actor named Clancy Brown. He's been in many things over the decades. This was a wonderful role. And his arc is surprisingly similar in the book as it is in the movie. First training Johnny, seeing potential in him, but then some things go awry. And then ultimately the sergeant reappearing in kind of a heroic role very late in the book as he leaves his role as a trainer and actually enters combat. So I find that the movie in that regard really is kind of fun, because you get to see the human aspect, and it's not all Johnny, 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 Johnny. What philosophy the movie does have is very, very limiting. I would say that the movie does a great job of portraying a militaristic society that is very good with its propaganda that glorifies war and glorifies victory. And we see that intercut throughout the film. I think it's a very effective device, and does kind of mirror, in a lot of unsettling ways, some of the advertisements and the campaigns that we've seen from our own military over the years. And so I think that's fascinating. But we also see the consequences of war in the film, and we really don't in the book. We see horrible, nasty death. We see an enemy that is far uglier, far more aggressive, far nastier than is portrayed in the book. And I should warn you, if you're going to watch the movie, be prepared to be grossed out, because this is a nasty enemy that does nasty damage to human beings. So keep that in mind. This is almost like science fiction, military horror, as opposed to the book, which is very much follows a military track. Now, one of the interesting distinctions between the two is in the philosophy, as I said earlier. In the book, we get Johnny's high school teacher, a teacher who teaches a course called History and Moral Philosophy. And this is a course that is only allowed to be taught by veterans. So they're coming at this from a very specific point of view. And in the book, his name is Mr. Dubois. In the movie, his name is Mr. Ratchek. And what's fascinating is, in the book, there is a character named Ratchek who has died before the movie begins and has become somewhat legendary for what he did in combat. What the film has done is put Ratchek in this role as the teacher, so that later on he will be involved in combat and we will be able to see him go from one point to the other. I think it's very effective and allows that philosophy to kind of carry throughout the film. I want to read you a couple of excerpts from the book to kind of give you a sense of where philosophy plays a role, moral philosophy in particular, in the book, because this is where the book becomes very relevant to today's world. So I want to look at a particular section here where Mr. Dubois is going through a lesson in his class with Johnny and the other students regarding value. The word value. Is its meaning absolute or relative? In other words, you either value it or not. It has value or it doesn't. Or is it relative depending upon the individual? Ultimately, he says this: nothing of value is free. Even the breath of life is purchased at birth only through gasping effort and pain. If you boys and girls had to sweat for your toys the way a newly born baby has to struggle to live, you would be happier and much richer. As it is with some of you, I pity the poverty of your wealth. Now, this is an important idea because it does go into the whole idea of this militaristic society whereby service, military service, a completed term, is essential if you plan to have full citizenship. You have truly, well and truly earned the right to vote. Now, as we go further on, Dubois also challenges students regarding the notion of law and order and punishment. And that is, how do we teach children about what it is that they should value when we talk about the difference between right and wrong? And here is what he has to say about what he believes was a problem with society in the past, where society began to devolve. He says, corporal punishment in schools was forbidden by law. Flogging was lawful as sentence of court only in one small province, and there only for a few crimes, and was rarely invoked. It was regarded as cruel and unusual punishment. I do not understand objections to cruel and unusual punishment. While a judge should be benevolent in purpose, his award should cause the criminal to suffer, else there is no punishment, and pain is the basic mechanism built into us by millions of years of evolution, which safeguards us by warning when something threatens our survival. Why should society refuse to use such a highly perfected survival mechanism? He says, punishment must be unusual or it serves no punishment. He is building the argument that children need to be firmly punished repeatedly in order to understand these differences between right and wrong. He goes on to build this argument by saying, man has no moral instinct. He is not born with moral sense. You were not born with it. I was not, and a puppy has none. We acquire moral sense when we do through training experience and hard sweat of the mind. These unfortunate juvenile criminals were born with none, even as you and I, and they had no chance to acquire any. Their experiences did not permit it. Where is moral sense? It is an elaboration of the instinct to survive. The instinct to survive is human nature itself, and every aspect of our personalities derives from it. Anything that conflicts with the survival instinct acts sooner or later to eliminate the individual and thereby fails to show up in future generations. We have to teach morality, he says, and we have to do it firmly because the moral sense is something that is earned and it is passed down through the generations of a society. And this again goes back to this notion of the things that are of value are the things that you have earned, and maybe in this case even learned. So here really, I think, comes to the core of the philosophy of what we're seeing seep through this book. Much later on in the story, a major is telling Johnny Rico about the notion of responsibility in society. And this again goes back to this idea of society's belief here that you have to go through service in order to be able to have the right to vote. The major says, both for practical reasons and for mathematically verifiable moral reasons, authority and responsibility must be equal. Else a balancing takes place as surely as current flows between points of unequal potential. To permit irresponsible authority is to sow disaster. To hold a man responsible for anything he does not control is to behave with blind idiocy. The unlimited democracies were unstable because their citizens were not responsible for the fashion in which they exerted their sovereign authority, other than through the tragic logic of history. No attempt was made to determine whether a voter was socially responsible to the extent of his literally unlimited authority. If he voted the impossible, the disastrous possible happened instead, and responsibility was then forced on him willy-nilly and destroyed both him and his foundationless temple. And he goes on to say how this is the way society is, basically suggesting that you do not want voting by the masses because the most powerful right of the individual, the most powerful responsibility is this sovereign access to the vote. And if you cannot judge if someone has really earned that right, then you risk the possibility that they collectively are going to destroy society because they are going to make very unwise decisions. So there are many moral and philosophical debates like this in the book, and this perhaps is one of the things that you can point to this book and say, okay, this is something to read and really think about. This is where we talk about literature as opposed to just straight up novels, but it is very interesting. There are a number of plot elements that hold between the book and the movie. The bugs destroy Buenos Aires with a meteor, which is really the thing that escalates the war. In the movie, Johnny and Carmen and Carl and all their families, well, they lived in Buenos Aires. In the book, Johnny's mother was visiting Buenos Aires when it happened. And we do conclude on Planet P in search of a brain bug, which is the intellectual cast of the enemy, trying to figure out how the enemy works. If you can kind of cut off the head, so to speak, you got a chance at tearing down the enemy. What's also similar is the ending of both the book and the film. Despite the many losses along the way, both end up on a very upbeat note. There is no resolution whatsoever. However, the movie shows our soldiers in a propaganda video continuing the fight, ending with the words, "and they will win." The book ends with this particular quote as Johnny is about to begin a drop to a planet. It says, "to the everlasting glory of the enemy. So what are the recommendations? If you're going to read the book, I will tell you this: skip chapter 1. Ignore it. Pretend it's not there. It's about 20 plus pages of a drop ship going down with Johnny inside it to the enemy. It is frenetic. It is kinetic. You can't keep up with anything. You're looking here, you're looking there, and it's really quite crazy. And it really doesn't do anything. The mission is ultimately not successful. It's a flash forward, I guess, to kind of get you invested in the book, but you don't know Johnny at that point, so it really doesn't matter. And frankly, chapter 1 does not match the tone, style, or pacing of the rest of the novel. Chapter 2 is where the story begins, and that's what I would recommend you start if you do choose to get the book. Remember, the movie, it's a popcorn flick. It's fun. It is very dramatic at times. The gore factor is high. The body count is high, but it does not shy away from the brutality of war. And I think that, and really its propaganda aspects, really do give the movie some high marks. So I think it's an excellent popcorn flick in that regard. So there you go. That's kind of my general assessments. The book, the movie, nothing alike. Go forth and conquer. And by the way, if you have some agreements or disagreements, please put those down in the comments. I would love to hear from you.